You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Campus podcast. I'm Miranda Prynne, editor of Campus and your host for this week's episode, in which we will discuss what constitutes good teaching in higher education. First, for those of you unfamiliar with Campus, it is Times Higher Education's platform where academics and university staff can share their expertise in the form of practical advice for their peers. Now, since teaching sits at the very heart of the higher education mission, it will come as little surprise that we boast a huge and varied range of expert resources focused on how to deliver top quality teaching. But what commissioning and editing advice on effective teaching has taught me is that there are no simple answers to how to teach well. One of the challenges of discussing what constitutes good teaching is that it really depends who you are teaching, as well as what, when, where, and of course why. And this is what I was keen to explore with two academics who are engaged in both delivering teaching but also researching teaching from various perspectives. First, I spoke with Leon Tickley, who is a professor in education at the University of Bristol, also UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Good Quality Education and Global Chair in Education at Bristol University. Alongside this, Leon co-directs the Centre for International and Comparative Education, and he has carried out extensive research into education systems all over the world, particularly in Africa, as well as investigating UK government initiatives designed to raise educational attainment among disadvantaged groups. Beyond all this, Leon actually started his teaching career as a science teacher in London Comprehensives, and then later at a school for South African refugees in Tanzania. So it would be difficult to find someone who has a better understanding of effective educational delivery in different settings. And this is where our conversation started. Hi, Leon. Thanks for joining us on the podcast to discuss the nuances of effective teaching. Now, you have both taught and carried out research into education all over the world, with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. So I wondered if you could give an overview of what, open quotes, good teaching, close quotes, looks like in different global educational contexts.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks, Miranda, and thanks for inviting me to talk about this important topic. So good teaching, of course, at one level is very context dependent. It depends on which part of the world you're talking about, what area of higher education, whether it's academic higher education or more vocational higher education, and so on. I think broadly speaking, everywhere that I've been in the world and looked into this matter, it's about engaging students, making the curriculum relevant to them, finding a way of bridging the backgrounds of the students with the curriculum to give them access, being inclusive in approach, and above all, making sure that the curriculum is relevant to them, to their needs, to the needs of the communities that they're from, and to the needs of their future vocations. But what that actually looks like in different contexts can be quite different. In northern Western global contexts, for example, that we might have the luxury of having slightly smaller teaching groups, whereas in the African context, that really is a luxury. The norm is to have very large groups. So, the context matters hugely. I think in all cases, issues of inclusion are very, very important.
Yeah, of course. And I can see you talk about the fact the curriculum or curricula need to be moulded according to the skills that are needed within that particular geography or that particular educational context. But when it comes to student engagement, would you say there are some universal approaches that work across the board, or do those also vary?
Yes, I think there are. So I do think that students might have different learning styles that are linked to their own backgrounds, whether that be in China or in Africa or in the UK or wherever. But I think generally speaking, it's about making the curriculum accessible to students through making it relevant to their backgrounds and their needs, through understanding their prior learning experience as a way of bridging their backgrounds with the content of the curriculum. And I think a key aspect actually is the question of language. And this is something that's often overlooked in higher education, but it's so important. And especially when we're dealing with increasingly diverse classrooms. And by diverse, I mean culturally diverse. So students come with different kinds of linguistic capital, if you like, different languages that they speak, different home languages. But it can also be a question of socioeconomic class and the academic register and giving students access to the academic register that's used in the mainstream classroom. But I also think, this question of relevance also needs to be looked at different scales as well. So you're asking about engagement, and making the curriculum relevant is obviously really important to engagement, but that doesn't just necessarily mean in terms of local development needs, if you like, or immediate career prospects or opportunities in the country that we're talking about. Increasingly, we're in a global world with increasing levels of mobility, but also where ideas are increasingly mobile, and it's important, I think, to develop, where the challenges that we face as a world are increasingly global. They're global challenges, whether those be climate change or issues of migration or issues of conflict or issues to do with any area of sustainable development, really, that you care to look at. So I think, developing critical awareness of the global dimensions of learning is increasingly important, and developing global citizenship within student bodies around the world is very important, and something I think higher education institutions in different parts of the world are giving increasing prominence to.
Yes, it's multi-layered. You can see that you've got these huge global overarching themes around global challenges, but as you say, then much more contextual considerations in which those are going to be relevant and therefore can be effectively taught. I know you are very engaged in work to decolonize curricula and involved in educating fellow academics in this process. How have colonial legacies affected what we consider as good teaching, and how can that be broken down in ways that sort of enhance inclusion and, I guess, learning outcomes?
Okay, well, that's a very big question. So I think one needs to look at the history, the colonial history, and to understand that universities in their modern form were really, introduced through colonialism, whether that's be their development in former colonizing countries, but also very much so in colonized countries that were colonized. So that the form that the modern university takes is very much based on a Western model. And historically, in many parts of Africa, for instance, the model of education was really of higher education. It was introduced as a very elitist institution, one really to train a small, very small minority of indigenous elites to play a role within the colonial hierarchy. And it really propagated a monoculture, if you like. It was also a vehicle for promoting almost exclusively Western ideas about what counts as legitimate knowledge, what counts as legitimate research, at the exclusion of indigenous knowledge systems and languages. And that's been a huge detriment to the development of higher education, all of these factors. So we see, for example, that many curricula in Africa are relevant to meeting local needs, whether it's in health, meeting the local health challenges, or whether it's in engineering, or whether it's in education. Often the theories, the ideas that are considered are often Northern and Western in orientation. And this is hugely constraining in terms of the relevance of the curriculum. But another aspect of the colonial legacy, more recently in the African context, has been the impact of global agendas that have been driven by the interests of former colonizing powers, essentially in the global north. So powerful Western interests through, for example, structural adjustment lending in the post-colonial period. What we witnessed through that was this idea of conditional lending to governments, where governments invested in education, but according to global agendas. And they were asked, or the demand was during the 1980s when structural adjustment lending was introduced by the IMF and World Bank, to prioritize primary education at the expense of higher education. So whereas, higher education had begun to play a role in creating a new cadre of African leadership, it was completely undermined through structural adjustment. And we see today that legacy in terms of very overcrowded classrooms, very limited facilities, and, within the research arena, African academics are hugely underrepresented in publications, in global publications, and in research applications for research funding and so on. So that's a very unfortunate legacy. And then, of course, in former colonizing countries, you see also the omission of knowledges, of ways of conceiving of knowledge outside of quite a narrow Western kind of view. And that has different aspects to it. So on the one hand, if you take a subject like mathematics, for example, you won't get to understand, if you're a mathematics student, in many instances, the origins of mathematics, in knowledge systems and Arabic and other knowledge systems that predated the European Renaissance. You don't get to understand how knowledge has been developed by scholars from different parts of the world in different ways. It tends to be very Eurocentric in focus. So that's also very limiting for our students and constraining in terms of their ability to draw on different ideas, different knowledge systems rooted in different cosmologies, to understand diversity of ways of understanding the natural and social worlds. And in this day and age, that's increasingly important because whether it's climate change or other areas of sustainable development, these are highly complex tasks. And we see in the case of climate change, for instance, the value of being able to draw on indigenous as well as scientific, modern scientific understandings of climate change adaptation to develop solutions that are effective, that work. So that's been a very unfortunate legacy.
You mentioned a monoculture, and I can see the effect of a lack of diverse ways of thinking, diverse approaches to learning and knowledge has quite an insidious effect. It's vital really for kind of creative problem solving, being able to draw on lots of different ways of thinking. But also, I imagine if you're able to diversify the way you are teaching, the knowledge you're drawing on, the kind of heritage of that knowledge, it's also much more appealing to a much greater diversity of students. You talked about relevance. That is likely to make it more interesting and relevant for more students. Bringing it back to UK context, I know you have actually looked at sort of UK government initiatives aimed at raising educational attainment among Black and minority ethnic learners who are at risk of underachieving. What lessons can you draw for university educators in terms of what has actually proven effective in raising attainment among disadvantaged student groups?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And of course, we need to understand that the problems are systemic often, whether it's to do with forms of institutionalized racism or the monoculture of the curriculum, and they require a whole institutional response, and they require a whole system response. So, in terms of the institution, it's about leaders taking responsibility for these areas, and all of these are lessons that can be learned really from work in schools, as you've correctly pointed out. So leaders that take these issues seriously, that don't just delegate them to somebody else, but actually take real ownership of issues of race equality, of inclusion, of diversity within institutions. But also, issues to do with the curriculum as well, making sure that it's diverse and relevant, that educators within institutions are aware of the diversity that they're dealing with, but also have the resources through professional development to develop their own expertise. And this is something I think that comes through very strongly in the research, both in schools and universities, about how disempowered educators often feel in relation to these issues, having never been exposed to them previously, and possibly, from their own backgrounds and experiences, not having been exposed to these kinds of to diversity themselves. So there are those kinds of issues. There are also issues to do with recognizing and challenging racism in institutions, and we know from different recent evidence the extent of racial harassment, of bullying, and sadly we've seen that increase rather than decrease in recent years. Universities need to have robust policies for tackling this, because it is a cause for the attainment gap that we still see in universities, that Black students often feel that they're victims of different kinds of microaggressions, but also of an absence of role models, which is another huge institutional aspect to this whole thing. That when we're talking about a whole institutional response, we need to also be thinking about the diversity of faculty, not just at junior levels, but all through the university. And this does make a difference. It makes a difference in schools and in universities and higher education when students feel that they can see amongst faculty people who look and sound like them. I think a big issue is around language, and in increasingly diverse language, of course, is the medium through which learners engage with the curriculum. And if they're going to succeed, then and the curriculum is going to be accessible to them, then the issue of language needs to be very carefully thought through. And I don't think it really is. I think universities bend over backwards to try and attract international students, but then don't necessarily have the resources or the know-how to really provide the support that's urgently required by many of these students. And it's the same with some of our home students as well. Whether we're talking about minority ethnic learners or learners from working class backgrounds, the issue of language, making language accessible to learners, providing the right kind of support, is really important. And so I think those are some of the issues. I think another aspect of a whole institutional response is the way that we engage with our communities. So in my university, for example, we're currently going through a process, a transition, where we're trying to engage much more directly, much more positively with our Black and minority communities in the very diverse city of Bristol. And this is so important because we don't attract enough students from Bristol, let alone Black and minority ethnic learners. So making it clear that the university is actually for everybody and should be accessible to everybody. It's not just the ivory tower on the hill. And this means engaging with communities. And in the US, they do this, I think, better than we do here in terms of student engagement programs and so on. But it means that we have to proactively be looking to engage with our communities to solve the problems that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. So all of those aspects really are part of what I would describe as a whole institutional response. A strong leadership, a relevant curriculum, a real attentiveness to the attainment gap, and an evidence-led approach to how it can be closed, an attentiveness to institutionalized racism, a recognition that it is a reality, sadly, for many of our Black and minority ethnic students, and being proactive and transparent in the way that it's addressed, investing in staff development so that staff are empowered, our educators are empowered to deal with increasingly diverse learner bases, and engaging with our communities. All of those are things that we've seen work in schools, and I think as a higher education sector, we need to be more attentive to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fairly well documented now that for students to thrive in terms of their learning, they have to first feel comfortable, safe, feel a sense of belonging, and all of that really has got to come from those things you've just outlined. Finally, based on your accrued experience of teaching, how have you adapted your own instructional approach in line with evolving student needs or wishes and wider social and political changes that inevitably affect how education is delivered?
That's a very good question. And of course, we need to be constantly attentive to these wider contextual changes. And part of being an educator at any level is being open to updating your own practices. And the pandemic did teach us a lot. It taught us a lot about the importance of student engagement, precisely that, but also, the potential, but also the pitfalls of technology, which is increasingly becoming a core part of teaching and learning in higher education rather than something that's peripheral. So there's a constant need for us to update our understanding of what works. And I think, I've had to go through a huge learning curve in terms of understanding how I can work with technology in an inclusive way, because it's not necessarily straightforward how one does that. And it's not just about giving learners access to different kinds of technology. It's about understanding how to use technology inclusively, but also being attentive to the changing political situation, as you've pointed out. I mean, we've seen at the moment, for example, a rise in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the UK, which is linked to the war on Gaza at the moment. And I think, it's really important as educators that we're aware, that we're attentive, we find ways of trying to talk to our students about these issues in a way that's, obviously sensitive to their own positionality and experiences, but also, gives them exposure to all sides of the story of the issue. Most of all, to give them the critical capacity to make up their own minds. And I think That really, at the end of the day, goes back to the question about engagement as well, because we're trying to develop critical thinkers with the agency to make transformative change. So, keeping up to date, engaging students means that we have to keep up to date as well as educators.
Of course, giving students the tools to critically analyze information is arguably ever more important in this digital age of information overload.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Yeah.
Great. Well, Leon, it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Miranda. You're very welcome.
We covered a huge range of issues in that conversation, but there is a definite strand running through it, which is that inclusion needs to sit at the heart of any good education system. And that applies to the course content, the curricula, the way teaching is delivered, as well as the organisational and support structures around it. And one can see from Leon's breakdown there how work on decolonisation can be a really powerful driver towards greater inclusion. Of course, inclusion has a very practical side to it, linked to issues like accessibility, but it is a highly emotional thing. I mean, it's something one experiences. This focus on emotions and how it affects the learning process is something that I wanted to ask my second guest about. Jason Lodge is Associate Professor of Educational Psychology and Director of the Learning, Instruction and Technology Lab at the University of Queensland's School of Education. So again, Jason can give the research perspective, but he also knows how models of educational psychology may actually play out in the classroom. Jason's recent work has been very focused on the evolving role of AI in education. He's an expert advisor to the OECD and the Australian National Task Force on AI in education. So, given that this is something many across the sector are really hungry for advice on, I also tried to mine some of his expertise in this area. Hi, Jason. Great to talk to you.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, you are a psychological scientist by training, and I just wondered, how does your knowledge of psychology support your teaching?
In a few different ways. I do tend to think about the basic learning processes, things to do with memory, attention, metacognition in particular. And I think about ways that I can apply the basic research that we do on learning processes to the things that I do in my teaching. It's not easy to do that. It requires a bit of translation because most of the work I do as a psychological scientist is obviously in a lab environment where we try to control everything and try and get a sense of cause and effect relationships. And classrooms are not like that in any way, shape, or form. They're always very complicated with, multiple different people and different ideas and different learning processes going on. But I do think it's really important to have a solid foundation in those basic processes. And I do try to use those in various different ways to help support student learning.
Yeah, I can see what you're alluding to there, I suppose, is the context in which you're teaching, and those classroom dynamics hugely affect how the psychology plays out. But is that insight into sort of the human condition helpful in at least understanding why students might be responding to certain things and not others, and so on?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the most powerful ones for me, and this relates to some of the work that I do with my lab team, is to understand how people understand their own learning. We've got a lot of research that helps us to understand how people make judgments about, how they're learning over time. And you can see some of those things playing out with students. So it's always good to have a sense of where they think they are relative to where they actually are, because I think that can provide a really good way to be able to help them to be able to calibrate their understanding of their own learning. And over time, as that calibration gets better, I think students then become more expert and are able to make better decisions in their learning. So that's one of the main areas where I think there's a huge advantage. But again, for every student, that's going to look different. And I have, 250 students. So it's challenging to take that basic research and translate it, but I think it can be really powerful if it's done well.
Yeah, of course. On the students, how do you think their learning needs have changed in recent years? I mean, specifically since the pandemic.
It's a great question. I think part of this depends on which kind of level you're starting to look at it. So some of the things that we've discussed already about memory and about attention and metacognition and sort of these basic processes, those things haven't changed really. They are fairly consistent. You know, these are sort of standard ways in which humans learn. However, we have seen that what students are looking for in an educational experience in higher education has changed. So there's a weird tension there that we know quite a bit about these fundamental processes, but how they're playing out in the kind of environment that we're in now can look a bit different. And I think one of the main ways that we're seeing that is that students are demanding more flexibility in their learning. So we've now seen, and we've all gone through this period where we've been able to learn online. There were some hiccups and some speed bumps along the way, but it worked there and thereabouts. And I think we've now seen an acceleration of what has been a longer term trend towards a more flexible way of being able to have a higher education experience. So interesting tension there. But I think we've got a pretty solid basis to work from, and we understand what those basic learning processes are.
Yeah, and is there any effect on the social dynamics in the class since the pandemic? Because that is something that was talked about a lot as a key concern, that so many school students, as they would have been then, were essentially isolated through very formative years of their lives, and they will now be coming into universities. I just wonder if it's affected how they interact with one another and their social skills at all.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that that's been widely reported that there are some challenges around that transition back to a more kind of face-to-face environment. What I think has been really interesting is that the institution that I work for, the University of Queensland, we're a very campus-oriented institution. We have a beautiful campus in Brisbane, Australia. But even though the majority of the activities are centered around the campus, when we talk to students, they've kind of adapted to this new world that we find ourselves in. And a lot of them are telling us that the majority of their social interaction is actually occurring in private chat forums, whether it's WhatsApp or for a lot of them, it's places like Instagram Messenger. So I think what has happened is that there's also been a bit of an adjustment. Yes, there are some issues because the social interaction is not quite the same online as it is in real life. But there are ways in which I think students have started to adapt to this new reality, and private chat forums are one really big example of this, where the social interaction has shifted and molded and is now taking advantage of some of the opportunities that are available through online interaction.
So hybrid socializing alongside hybrid education. Obviously, they're still finding ways to connect, which is, I guess, the key and most important thing. Now, you co-authored with colleagues at the University of Queensland a really excellent collection of advice resources for campus, outlining what you call the higher education learning framework. So for those unfamiliar with this, could you just briefly explain what it is and how it should be applied?
Sure can. So what we were attempting to do here is to really focus on the learning piece. I think what tends to happen for us in higher education a lot is that when we talk about learning, what we're really talking about is teaching, and the two of them bleed into each other a lot. And let me give you the classic example of this, blended learning. Right? It says blended learning, but when we think about blended learning, it's often about a teaching approach that we're really talking about, and we're not necessarily talking about the student's experience of that approach. So what we want to try to do with this is to say, okay, if we really focus just on the learning piece here, what are the most important things that we need to focus on? And we interviewed some of the world's leading experts, people who have been thinking about this for decades. And from those interviews, we distilled this down into a set of 7 key principles that are just about learning. So what does good learning look like in higher education? And they're things like learning is a process of becoming. It needs to be contextualized. Emotions are a really important part of the learning process. It should be interactive. We want to help students learn how to learn. We want to take challenges and difficulties in the learning process seriously and build opportunities to experience those challenging moments in the learning process. And we would hope that it's a deep and meaningful learning experience for students. So those are the sorts of principles that we came out with on the basis of these interviews.
Yeah, and you've just alluded there to the fact one of the resources in the collection does look specifically at the role of emotions in learning. I want to delve into that a bit more. Can you explain how emotions affect learning in a bit more detail and how educators could use this knowledge for better outcomes?
Absolutely. So I think one of the issues that we've had with the role of emotions in learning is that the research on this is relatively new. We're talking, 10, 20 years that has really taken the role of emotions in the learning process seriously. There are the kind of obvious ones. People often will experience anxiety when they're, engaged in learning mathematics, for example. But there are many other emotions related to the learning process that are just as important that we either ignore or we just assume that they're negative and want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. What the research that, again, I've been involved in and is going on around the world is showing that some of these emotional responses are actually really critical part of the progression of learning over time. Now, confusion is the one that we've spent a lot of time thinking about as an example. Uh, One of the most powerful things you can experience as a teacher or as a student is when a student has an aha moment, right? That's one of the most, it's one of the greatest things about being a teacher is seeing all of these faces light up in the class or, in a virtual classroom when all of a sudden the students kind of get it. But you can't have that experience unless you go through this period of kind of being stuck and being confused about something. It's a critical stepping stone on the way to having that kind of revelation that you experience an aha moment as part of. So I think we've tended to, in the past, look at things like having a class of students who are confused about something and saying, we've got to stop this immediately, when actually sometimes it's an important part of that process. And maybe we need to support that in a different way by, for example, suggesting maybe you want to try a different approach to learning this. If you're stuck on something and confused about it, it's not a signal that you can't do it or it's too hard. It might just be a signal to try something different. And once you start to reframe that discussion about what some of these emotions are, then I think you can have a much more effective way to help students to work through some of these points where they get stuck, which are an important part of the process.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That one shouldn't just seek instant gratification, positive emotions, whatever you want to phrase them as. This is part of the education process because there's got to be that seeking of solutions and problem solving. And when something does finally make sense, that feeling of reward that you ultimately get as a student, as the person learning, there seems to be a definite move towards this idea of productive failure and acknowledging that sometimes failure and not understanding something is as intrinsic to learning as feeling very comfortable and happy in the classroom. But on the more positive emotions, I mean, there is also obviously a strong argument that students need to feel comfortable, safe, confident in order to learn. How can you balance those two things? Do you have any advice on that?
Not easily. And I think this is where the more support that we can give to people who are at the chalk face, who are doing the teaching work, to understand how these dynamics work, I think the better place we are. It's not something where you can approach this in any sort of formulaic way, because you're absolutely right. Students need to feel safe. They need to feel like they belong. And those are absolutely critical in order to have a higher education experience at all. So it's really about balancing the things that we want to make simple, straightforward, comfortable for students, but the things that we kind of need them to be a little bit uncomfortable about on the way through, being very clear about what those things are and making sure that we're not making the things that should be comfortable, uncomfortable unnecessarily. But that can be quite complex, and it's going to look different in each context. We generally think about this as being, if a student needs to change their conception of something, the way that they're kind of thinking about something, often that will require at least a little bit of discomfort on the way through. So if the focus is on that conceptual idea rather than making other things uncomfortable and difficult, I think you can start to then separate out the parts of what we do as teachers that are important to create that kind of disequilibrium or discomfort, and the other areas where we just want to make it kind of as streamlined and comfortable and normalized as possible.
On that, the complexity around making students feel like they belong and feel safe within their learning environment, that brings in much wider issues as well around the whole of their university life. And I wondered how much university learning you think actually takes place in the classroom, and how much is about the wider life experiences and self-discovery that one would hope is happening in tandem with academic studies.
It does vary with each student, and I think it also varies between the different contexts in which they might find themselves studying. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about an online program, that's going to look very different to one that's very deliberately blended, or one that's very sort of campus focused, and the mix in which the environment is set up in each of those circumstances is going to look quite different as well. But there are a couple of trends I think that suggest that there are some things that are changing quite markedly there. The first is, as we've touched on already, that students are looking for, and most higher education institutions around the world are providing greater levels of flexibility for students, so that they can then integrate their study into other parts of their life, as you've alluded to, Miranda. I think that's important. Students are asking for that; they're demanding that, and we're figuring out ways to be able to provide that. So that flexibility means that the balance between what's going on inside and outside the classroom is obviously going to shift. The other trend I think that is really important here is that, and we've talked to a lot of students about this, and I think this is really different to what it was 20 years ago, or perhaps longer when I went through. Students don't necessarily see themselves as university students first. It's not the primary identity that they have. They might see themselves as in a particular social group, or part of, their employment group, or they might feel more attached to other kind of social identities. And the idea that they're a higher education student has moved down the list a bit. And I think as a result of that, we've got this increased flexibility, we've got these changing identities, and I think that then means that the way that students are balancing how they're going about their learning is changing as much as it is anything that we're doing as higher education institutions. So there's an interesting dynamic, I think, emerging there, but it certainly suggests that there's going to be a complex mix of learning going on across different environments that slots in with the various other things that students have got going on in their lives.
That's a very interesting point. Just back to the higher education learning framework. Now, the advice you shared based on those 7 principles came before the explosion of generative AI into our lives. I know that you have done a lot of work looking specifically at the role of AI in education. So now that AI and its use is so widespread across all sectors, higher education being one of them, how should educators adapt?
Oh boy, it's a big one, isn't it? So I think there's a couple of key things here that have kind of emerged over the last 18 months or so of grappling with this. One, I think the issue that many of us have been talking about, and that has occupied a lot of discussion over that time, about whether or not students are using these tools to cut corners or cheat, or do something where they're not necessarily getting the full experience out of assessment items that they might be completing. It does suggest that we probably do need to spend a little bit more time focusing on these key elements of learning. And part of the reason I say that is my colleague Kath Ellis really summed this up nicely. You've got to stop at some point looking for evidence of cheating, and we have to rethink what we're doing in our assessment to actually look for evidence that learning has occurred. And I think part of the reason we're in a little bit of a pickle at the moment is that we've kind of just assumed that because a student writes an essay, we're going to be able to somehow infer in a very valid way that the learning has gone on that allowed them to arrive at that. We have a lot less confidence that that's the case now, because machines can produce that kind of work. So I think that means we have to be more serious about that process of learning and look at it more closely. The second reason I think that this is really important is that these machines represent a very different human computer type relationship than what we've had in the past. This is not like a calculator. You don't need some fundamental knowledge in mathematics or anything else in order to interact with these things. So the barrier for entry has kind of disappeared. If you can type something in, any one of 100 different languages, you can interact with one of these generative AI tools. So in some respects, they act more like a peer, even though they're not a peer, but they're at the same time, they're a tool. So the work that we're doing is suggesting that the students who are getting the most out of this, going back to the principles that we had in the higher education learning framework, are the students who understand their own learning the most. because you don't need to have a lot of technical know-how in order to use these tools. So it's telling us that learning how to learn in particular is going to be perhaps the superpower of the age of AI. It's less about technical ability. You don't need to code these things. They're pretty intuitive and will get more intuitive over time. Learning how to learn is kind of the key element, I think, because while the technology is a certain way now, it's going to continue to evolve. There's a lot of uncertainty about where this is all headed. The students and indeed the employees in the future who can adapt to that environment and have the right kind of adaptive skills and knowledge are the ones who are going to benefit from this the most. So again, I think it points to this being a key set of skills for what students are going to need in the age of AI.
Yeah, and students change, the context in which education functions changes, as we're discussing. You talk about learning to learn. Are there any key components to successful learning that you think do kind of transcend all of this change and upheaval?
I think something that requires no knowledge whatsoever is knowing what to do when you get stuck or knowing how to ask for help. I think for many of us, I was the first in my family to ever attend university. If I got stuck on something, I would take that as a sign that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I didn't belong there. So I think having some idea of how to get help, how to ask others and how to work through that process is one of the kind of critical skills that you can start with. And then there are a whole lot of others that kind of flow on from there, having a set of different strategies, knowing which kinds of strategies seem to be more effective for certain types of knowledge and understanding than others. But I think that we kind of know what these key skills are and how transferable they are. It's just a matter of how we integrate that more into what we're doing in higher education, because it is such a critical set of transferable skills. You don't need to know something to know that you're stuck on something because you don't know enough about it yet, right? And to be able to work through that. So that is a key transferable thing that you can take into any domain. Accepting the fact that you are a novice in that domain and knowing how to operate from that point forward is really powerful.
Yeah, and that links very nicely back to the earlier points you made around the need for confusion sometimes in the learning process. Finally, I have to ask, I read that you were a chef. How did that prepare you for a career as an academic educator and researcher?
Interesting question. I'm not really sure. It made sure that I knew how to feed myself when I didn't have a lot of money as a student. I think it was interesting because I think part of the job is that I did work with apprentices and I helped them to learn. So it was a different kind of learning experience, and it was a different kind of teaching experience that I think ultimately has sort of helped me to think more broadly about the way that learning and teaching work, because it looks very different in that kind of workplace environment. Particularly one where there's high pressure when you've got hundreds of people that need to be fed in a very short time frame, and I think that ultimately has allowed me to have a kind of broader view about learning and teaching and think about it in different ways that perhaps I wouldn't have if I hadn't had that experience.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks so much for talking to me today. It's been fascinating.
Thanks, Miranda. It was great chatting.
So there are two very different discussions, but there are universal themes that emerge from even the most varied and broad-ranging conversations around teaching. The need to engage students, to nurture a sense of belonging among students, the need to make teaching relevant to their lives, past, present, future. I mean, Jason is very clear on what he believes university educators should be focused on, and that is teaching students how to learn. If you would like further practical advice on how to do this, or perhaps on the higher education learning framework described by Jason, or indeed pointers for decolonising your curriculum, you can find all this and more on campus. That is at timeshighereducation.com/campus. So I hope you found that useful, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.